With my last few videos centering on deep dives into detailed and rich, well-known RPGs, I got to thinking I wanted to give myself a bit of a break this time around, and cover something I could get through in a couple of days with minimal frustrations or worries. I also wanted to cover something from the 90s that I had not played before, something dungeony. How happy I was when I stumbled upon today's title, DeathKeep. It looked perfect for what I was after. It was made by SSI, a publisher and developer of many excellent titles. It featured a first-person dungeon crawl, great art style, and best of all, it seems almost non-existent on YouTube, so I could be one of the first to give this an in-depth review. Wildly, this game originally released not for the PC, but instead for the 3DO, that weird console we discussed in my Crusaders video. The console of course failed, and the company that made them moved on to developing games instead, but still, the beast of a thing holds a weird place in history from before 3 companies dominated the entire console market. In a time when tech companies were literally throwing anything at the wall and seeing what would stick. So, with a heart full of joy and wonder for Dungeons Undiscovered, I sent Gaben my finest $5 bill, installed the massive 280 megabyte game, and prepared myself for an evening of crawling through dungeons. How little I knew then that this would not be a fun romp into an overlooked gem, but instead a test of my own patience to complete a game best left in the shadows. DeathKeep is a game with very little online presence or following for a very good reason. That reason being that it is awful.
Subtle.
But I am nothing if not stubborn. I have committed to this course and I will see it through. My easy video game was going to prove a true challenge, and I wouldn't even be seeing the eponymous DeathKeep until after I had endured hours of pain. Our descent into madness begins.
Impudent dwarves, you tried to stop me once before. Now your failure shall be complete! Ha 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 ha! Ha ha!
Before we dive right into this relic, it's worth going through the gameplay this title offers to see just how one could be deceived into thinking they're going to have a good time. See, as much as DeathKeep fails, it is surprisingly ambitious for a dungeon crawler of the time. Released in 1995 for the 3DO, and 1996 for the PC, the game actually tried to do a lot that we hadn't seen before. Well, maybe that's not exactly true. We had probably seen all of this before, but not quite in this way. As much as the footage here might make DeathKeep seem like any other dungeon crawler of the era, it was actually really its own thing. Similarities exist, but I've personally never played anything quite like this. The game runs on the advanced Dungeons & Dragons rule set, kind of. And by that I mean you do get to create a character, and that character is going to have stats and spells from D&D, but really, they pretty much mean nothing. The stats you start with are what you're going to have for the rest of the game. You do level up, but everything happens in the background. From what I could tell, all this did was give you more health and maybe increase your damage, but even that's uncertain. You aren't really making a character here like in other dungeon crawlers. Instead, you get to just choose one of 3 pre-generated main characters. Either a dwarf fighter, an elven mage, or a half-elf fighter/mage. If you've been on this channel for more than 10 minutes, you'll know this is a no-brainer for me. I'm playing the dwarf. The good news is, it literally doesn't matter what class you choose. All of them have access to more magic than you could ever want. This game is littered with orbs, or wands in the 3DO version. Each of these orbs contains multiple uses of a specific spell, and they are in massive abundance. I literally could not use orbs fast enough to account for how many I would be finding throughout the game. So I feel like playing a dedicated magic user would be completely redundant. Plus, the dwarf just has to be the canon choice. The whole game takes place inside a destroyed dwarven mountain keep. It's sort of funny. Each class gets their own little intro where we're told that they need to reclaim the land of their ancestors. But if I'm playing an elven mage, how in the hell is the land of my ancestors a desecrated dwarven mountain kingdom? It makes no sense.
This game barely has a story. You are far too invested.
Hey, maybe I want to be invested. This game is broken into levels, not so dissimilar to an FPS. Within those levels, there was a big emphasis on exploration. There were secrets to be found and power-ups to be collected. Loot came in the form of the aforementioned magic orbs, as well as armor, weapons, and potions of all sorts. In a neat sort of role-playing way, nearly everything in this game comes unidentified. You won't know what something does unless you either use it, or identify it with a limited-use scrying lens. Now this could have been a cool risk-reward thing, where you could choose to use your limited identifies on things, or risk using a potion that could potentially be toxic. But the game has such a huge abundance of scrying lenses that you could have just as easily removed the mechanic altogether. Like, I identified literally every item I picked up, and still finished the game with 3 completely untouched scrying lenses. On top of that, so much of the loot you pick up is either completely useless, or so obscure as to what it's actually doing as to make it worthless. Like, the game has at least 3 different types of strength potion. None of them seem to affect my strength stat, and enemies die in the same number of hits regardless if I've used the potion or not. What exactly are these things doing if not making me hit harder? Potions of heroism, same thing. Literally no change to my stats when used. And these things are everywhere. I have no idea what they're doing for me. No descriptions in the manual that I can find either. What is really wild is that there are so many types of buff potions. This is like a 6 to 8 hour game. There is no reason to have 3 tiers of strength potions, 2 tiers of heroism potions, speed potions, resistance potions, and invincibility potions. It is obscene. Funnily enough, there is a cure poison potion, but so far as I can tell, this game has no status effects. At least not from enemies. There was a poison potion at one point, but again, I can identify everything 3 times over. So there's no way I would ever drink that by mistake unless I really wasn't paying attention. There's a food and resting system in the game as well, in that you have a food meter that is filled by eating rations that you find around the world, and you could expend that food during rest in special areas to restore your health and your spells if you have them. The whole system becomes completely redundant mid-game due to a single item that I'll discuss later. At least for a fighter anyway. A caster might still have some cause to rest for spells, but I sort of doubt it, to be honest. Actual equipment you found was generally just straight upgrades. Like, there's not a lot of nuance between a +2 weapon and a +3 weapon. You take the bigger number. Rings had a bit more utility to them, but again, there were 2 that were just clearly the best rings in the game. There is 0 point wearing anything else. Outside collecting mostly useless loot, this game had the weirdest boot system I've ever seen. That's right, this game had a boot system, and it's wild. See, the game is actually pretty varied in its locations. From ice caves, to abandoned cities, to dwarven mines. You even visit the interior of a living skeleton castle. In each of these locales, you would really only have 3 threats: enemies, traps, and damaging ground. We'll touch on the traps in a moment, but the other one, the damaging ground, that one's weird. Each locale would have a different type of damaging ground, from things like ice water to lava and even dark ooze.
Ah, that's better. This isn't your average everyday
ooze.
This is
dark ooze. Each one would function the same, causing damage if you stand in it. Each one could be completely mitigated through wearing a specific type of boot. There were probably a solid 10 different damaging surfaces, each with their own respective pair of protective boots. What this led to was you having an inventory that was about 50% just boots, as you were never sure if you'd end up needing them again later. I got so tired of organizing boots that near the end I just dumped them all on the ground and resigned myself to just taking the damn damage. I was starting to feel like a basic white girl with my massive shoe collection. The traps in the game were similarly mind-boggling. Sometimes when you'd enter an area, the game would just launch a fireball at you. This would either do damage so minimal as to make you wonder if you even got hit, or kill you instantly. There was no in between. And if you're thinking, well, there must be other traps, nope, that's it. Only fireballs. There is also zero indication of traps. They're just invisible triggers. You'll know the trap is there when it's hitting you. Awesome. In terms of enemies, there was actually a massive amount of enemy variety on offer in this game. Each level would have 3 types of enemies, and while there was some overlap, generally you'd be seeing a new type of enemy or 2 each level. Pretty impressive for a game with 20 levels total. Sadly, this is pretty much just window dressing, as every single enemy could be approached in the exact same way. Point yourself at it and spam attacks or spells until it goes away. That's it. That's the entire combat loop. Sometimes they would have a ranged attack or it'd pop out of the ground to surprise you, but that was it. Every encounter was the same, including bosses. The artwork was cool, at least. When I call this the story section, I am using that term very, very loosely. This game's story is the equivalent to what you would expect from a first-time dungeon master on their first ever D&D campaign, in that the entire story sums up to little more than, big evil bad guy must be stopped. That said though, there are things in this game that I need to share with you all. You need to be a witness to my suffering. We get a fun little intro cinematic explaining the backstory here. An unnamed evil necromancer has assaulted a dwarven kingdom in order to usurp their gem of great power. The dwarves, however, used the gem against the necromancer and imprisoned him in ice for untold millennia. Apparently, it would have been impossible to just kill him, so instead they left this guy frozen in a brick like 15 feet from their front door. Flash forward many years, and the necromancer is now free of his icy tomb, and he takes his vengeance on the dwarven citadel. I have to point this out here, but the voice actor for the necromancer sounds exactly like Plankton from SpongeBob.
Impudent dwarves. You tried to stop me once before. Now your failure shall be complete!
I actually had to look it up because I was convinced this was the same guy, though I couldn't find a credit for whoever did the voice in this game. You can't prove it isn't him. We ourselves are practicing throwing axes at a target when our mystical amulet lights up. A 3-armed skeleton says we need to return to the land of our ancestors, find 3 magic orbs, and stop the evil necromancer. Should we not be more concerned that a 3-armed skeleton is telling us to go stop a necromancer? Like, doesn't that make anyone else think this might be a setup? Usually skeletons and necromancers are in league. Don't worry though, the story is not nearly in-depth enough to include a double cross. 3-armed skeleton man is firmly on our side. Maybe the necromancer forgot to pay him or something. Entering the now destroyed dwarven city, the game decides to start extremely strong with an ice level right out of the gate. Nothing like immediately throwing ice physics into your game before the player can even get the slightest chance to master the controls. The one good thing here is that controls are completely customizable, a rarity for games from this era. You can even get a WASD setup working fairly well, though there's no strafing as far as I can figure out. This level introduces pretty well all the mechanics this game will have to offer, from its wonky jumping, basic combat, and maze-like level design. Everything is here. There is a platforming section here that is a chore to get through, but the one saving grace is there's no limit on saving the game. So rather than try to redo the platforming, I can just save scum my way through it. Not the most honorable approach, but that's what this game gets for making their first level have ice physics. Stupidly enough, there is not another level in this game with ice. Like at all. Who thought it was okay to start like this? Unsurprisingly, once you get past the first level, the game improves significantly with no more ice. The goal of our quest becomes hunting down the 3 gems of power we need to stop the necromancer. We find one in an abandoned ruin, one in a magma-filled dwarven mine, and one in a deserted village inhabited by what I can only describe as gooey poison turtle men that don't actually poison you. These early levels had just the right amount of maziness to give you that rewarding feeling of figuring your way through without it becoming overly tedious. Loot was plentiful, but scarce enough that you didn't feel untouchable. These first couple of hours really did a great job in making me feel that the first level was just a rough start, and now that the game had found its groove, I'd be in for that great dungeon crawl I was after. I was wrong. Once you have all the gems and you make it to the first boss, a Glabrezu? Sorry, I suck at pronouncing things. A demon of the lower planes with 4 arms, 2 of them pincers and the head of a dog. He takes all of 15 seconds to defeat once you realize you need to use magic to damage him. Sadly, even with how simple the fight is, he is definitely the hardest in the game. We get another cutscene once the boss is down. We get to meet the 3-armed skeleton man in person, and he opens a portal to the home of our ancestors. Here we find a weird spire with 3 towers and a cathedral at the top. Apparently, the necromancer has corrupted the life-giving waters of each tower, and we must climb through each, cleanse them with the 3 orbs, then stop the necromancer at the cathedral. Sounds fine on paper, but this is where the game completely unravels. The first few levels of the game felt mostly balanced and reasonable, with appropriate loot, difficulty, and length. This first tower throws that right out the window. The game introduces a huge amount of verticality, unending key hunts, and just overall leans very heavily into the maze aspect. Prior to this, a level would be 15 to 20 minutes, at most. This first tower took me closer to an hour. To add to the monotony, the game at this point just starts absolutely dumping loot on the player character, both consumables and powerful equipment. In this level alone, I got an extra 6 or so AC points, as well as finding the Ring of Regeneration and the Ring of Sustenance. These rings do exactly what you might expect, with the former giving you a healing over time, and the latter keeping your character from ever getting hungry. So now in one level, we've made food redundant, removing an entire feature from the game, and the Ring of Regeneration is so effective that we are now essentially invincible. It heals so fast, none of the enemies can outpace it. The only thing that ever kills me again for the rest of the game are instant kill traps. Like, from a game design perspective, why would these not be balanced a bit better? They completely nullify any difficulty this game had from a combat perspective. Anyhow, after an hour of maze wandering and key hunting, we place the first orb and move on to Tower 2. I don't have a lot to say about Tower 2 outside it being unbelievably confusing. The whole thing is structured around jumping down into pits to get onto ledges below. But keep in mind, you cannot look up and down in this game, so this mostly just amounts to blindly jumping off cliffs hoping to land on the areas below. And much like the previous level, this place is a labyrinthine maze, where the goal is to find a key and get to the exit room. You also gain the ability to fly here, with a ring of flight and the boots of flight. They both do the exact same thing, so I have no idea why there are two separate items for it. Again, this game has way too much shit in it for how short it is. This is what flying looks like in the game. Absolutely awful. I found the key to escape this nightmare of a maze almost immediately, but it took me over an hour to find out where to use it in this complete shit show of a level. The relief I felt entering the end portal and finishing up here was palpable. Surely the worst was behind me. How wrong I was. With minimal frustrations or worries. The next and final tower is by far one of the worst designed gaming segments I have ever had the displeasure of experiencing in over 35 years. It starts off with hallways filled with will-o'-the-wisp enemies that are completely immune to magical weapons. It's worth noting here, I don't think a single weapon in this game up to this point has been non-magical. Even the axe I start with is +1, so I have no way to kill these things. For comedic effect, I need to read an excerpt from their description from the game manual. Will-o'-the-wisp. They are impossible to outrun and very difficult to hit. They are, like literally every enemy in this game, extremely slow-moving and extremely easy to outrun. And with my nigh invincibility, it is more obnoxious than challenging trying to get around the stupid things. But they're just the tip of the iceberg in this accursed map. See, the goal here is to get through a series of locked doors to end the level, and then place the final orb. But the keys for those doors are located in what I can only assume are pocket dimensions that are accessed through these weird gyroscope things. Inside each of these pocket dimensions, you'll find a maze of varying difficulty and a key. There are 5 of these mazes, and while most are annoying and far too long, one takes the absolute cake on the worst design I've ever encountered. You enter the dimension in a small room with a door and 3 teleporters. Going through the door reveals yet more teleporters. Enter a portal, and guess what? It brings you to another small room filled with portals. There is zero rhyme or reason as to where these portals go, and there are at least 3 or 4 floors of portals, each floor containing up to 36 individual rooms with at least 3 teleporters each. We are talking a teleporter maze with absolutely no governing logic, with hundreds of teleporters. This entire area was the equivalent of being given a combination lock and trying to unlock it by guessing combinations at random.
I'm here for some dungeon crawling excitement. Ah! You've cracked me skull, lad!
The worst part would be seemingly making progress, then realize you've somehow found your way back to the start. This maze took me hours, and I couldn't even cheat to look up a walkthrough if I wanted to. Nothing exists on this obscure game. So far as I know, no one else has ever finished this game because of how bad it is.
Why would you spread this evil to the internet?
The absolute tip-top of douchebaggery here is that the final exit to this maze is in a hidden wall. A wall I actually found relatively early in my teleporter frustrations, but I went past it because I didn't realize that on top of trying to memorize the outputs of 5 million teleporters, I should also be wall humping to find a goddamn hidden chamber. I did the math. This particular part of the game was 30% of my total game time. 30% of the game was on this one segment of this one level. Holy shit, it's bad. And the real kick in the nuts to top it all off, I only ended up needing 3 keys to get to the final chamber and finish the level. I could have skipped 2 of the 5 mazes. This wasn't even necessary. Whoever designed this level truly hated humanity. From here on, the game doesn't get good by any means, but it does become much less frustrating. The worst is in fact behind us. With the water now made blue instead of scary green and red, we can travel to the cathedral at the top of the spire. Here, we're too late. The necromancer does a sweet flying jump through a window and steals the power crystal, then escapes while leaving us with C-3PO to deal with. This boss takes 5 hits to kill and is done within about 4 seconds. I don't think he even attacked. With his magical rock, the necromancer Plankton is able to recreate the DeathKeep. I actually really liked the animation for this. It's got that weird early animation vibe going on. Three-armed Skeleton Man once again sets us on a path. We need to enter the DeathKeep, find the necromancer, and kill him while he conducts some sort of ritual with the stone. This part of the game is thankfully very short. Once again proving the level design in this game is a joke, there are 8 more levels. Just under half of the game is left. But this entire section takes me about 45 minutes. Some of these levels are 30 seconds long. I mean, I guess in the positives, the design of the DeathKeep is actually sort of neat, with all sorts of weird props, and some frankly unnerving enemy design. Like, look at this thing. It's grotesque. Towards the end, the game starts throwing bone golems at you pretty regularly. Listen to how they sound. Who thought, hey, this weird screech is definitely the sound a bone construct would make? I mean, I guess to be fair, the skeletons in Daggerfall also yell, but these ones take the cake for stupidest sounding skeleton. After our 45 minutes of DeathKeep gameplay in a game titled DeathKeep, we finish off the game with a boss rush of sorts. The first boss is an Ultraloth. It looks like a skinny lizard man with a cape. Dies in 2 seconds. Then we get to the final fight with the Necromancer. Want to see the gameplay footage of that? Here you go. This is the climax.
No!
Fucking awful. After he dies, we get a wrap-up summary, where the DeathKeep melts and the land is restored with us as its new ruler. I mean, we're the ruler of an empty frozen hellscape, but details don't matter, right? It's not like people play RPGs for the story or anything. DeathKeep released at the end of the D&D CRPG dungeon crawler era, so you would think it would be a well-developed RPG that learned the mistakes its counterparts made, or at the very least, that it would present something halfway enjoyable. This was not the case. While ambitious on paper, everything this game does is wildly wrong or just half-assed. The combat is super one-dimensional. Despite having the entire D&D rule set to pull from, they made everything devolve into the most basic of hack-and-slash tropes. Reduce enemy health to 0 while keeping your own topped up. The food and resting system was made completely redundant after the first few hours, and the game's last remaining draw would presumably be to those who want a game with strong maze-like dungeon crawling, but even that is done completely wrong. There is a ton to explore in each level, but with how unbelievably easy the game gets by about halfway through, there's no reason to explore anymore. The equipment is completely redundant to the experience. With each piece just being a direct upgrade to the last, they may as well have just removed it. The consumables were both useless in most cases, and so damn abundant that there's no way the player could ever come close to running out of anything. I swear to God, some levels the health potion to enemy ratio was literally 1-to-1, and that is not even factoring in your natural healing and ability to rest. The final boss takes quite literally 3 seconds to beat, but even if you did struggle, the stage prior gives you 6 invulnerability potions, each lasting 30 seconds. I could have spent the final 2 bosses completely impervious to harm. What kind of gameplay is that? The only place this game ever shines is in that mid-early time when you're still gathering the orbs. Enemies still pose a bit of a threat, and the loot hasn't gotten to obscene levels yet. Once you've passed the threshold of the first boss and gotten a couple levels under your belt, the game absolutely devolves into some of the worst designed maze simulation I have ever had the displeasure of partaking in. Key hunts for the sake of key hunts. Unthreatening enemies and messy inventory management is all that awaits players in the latter 2/3 of this game. And the pacing of it is so wildly unbalanced, you have to wonder if there was anyone managing this project at all. You had levels that ranged from 30 seconds on the low end to well over an hour on the high end. There is zero consistency. The final stretch of the game, where you finally reach the DeathKeep itself, is so easy and blasts by in the blink of an eye. It is unbelievably clear how much this game phoned it in the closing moments. Like the developers didn't expect anyone to actually make it that far. Which is a fair assessment. I wouldn't have finished this were I not so pig-headed and determined to make a video on this D&D disaster. The game did have some really cool artwork, especially in the monster designs. And the cinematics, while horribly cliché, do have a certain charm to them. But all of this is little more than set dressing on what is likely one of the worst dungeon crawlers ever released. I strongly recommend staying away from this title. The $5 price tag is about $20 too much. But if you do decide to play, for the love of all that is holy, stay the hell away from the teleporter maze. See you in the next video.